Asymmetric faction design in real-time strategy games represents one of the most challenging balancing acts in game development. Creating multiple sides that play completely differently while maintaining competitive fairness requires surgical precision and deep understanding of game systems. Most developers take the safe route, offering slight variations on shared themes. Think red tanks versus blue tanks, but the blue ones are slightly faster. These 5 games threw caution aside and created fundamentally different factions. Red Alert 2 established a template that most RTS games still follow today, probably because it worked and nobody wanted to risk their career trying something weird. The base game offered straightforward asymmetry between Allied technological superiority and Soviet brute force doctrines. The Allies relied on expensive, precise units like Mirage tanks and Prism technology, while Soviets overwhelmed enemies with cheap conscripts backed by devastating Tesla cores and Apocalypse tanks. It's a simple concept: smart rich guys versus angry poor guys with bigger guns. The Yuri's Revenge expansion transformed this foundation by introducing a third faction that completely ignored traditional warfare conventions. Yuri's army operated on mind control principles that turned enemy strength into weakness. Psychic units converted hostile forces rather than destroying them, while structures like the Grinder processed captured units into resources. This created a faction that grew stronger as battles intensified, feeding off enemy production rather than relying on standard base building economics. The psychological warfare extended beyond unit conversion into base mechanics themselves. Yuri's Psychic Dominator could instantly seize control of entire armies, turning enemy forces against their creators in devastating waves. Industrial plants reduced production by 25%, while grinders allowed Yuri to recycle mind-controlled enemy units for instant cash, effectively turning every successful mind control into both a military and economic victory. These mechanics created feedback loops where successful attacks generated the resources needed for larger assaults, making Yuri simultaneously the most dangerous faction while ahead and the most vulnerable when behind. The expansion demonstrated how a single rule-breaking faction could redefine an entire game's strategic landscape. Empire at War understood that Star Wars factions should feel as different as they appear on screen, which seems obvious until you remember how many licensed games completely botched this concept. The Empire wielded massive star destroyers and overwhelming firepower, reflecting their industrial might and authoritarian efficiency. Rebel forces compensated for inferior resources through guerrilla tactics, specialized strike teams, and superior starfighter technology. Forces of Corruption added the Zan Consortium, a criminal syndicate that operated outside conventional military doctrine because crime pays better than following the rules. Consortium forces corrupted enemy planets rather than conquering them, weakening opposition while generating passive income through criminal networks. Their hybrid units bridged space and ground combat in ways the Empire and Rebels could not match, while black market mechanics allowed resource manipulation impossible for legitimate factions. This created a three-way dynamic where each side pursued victory through fundamentally incompatible methods. The corruption system fundamentally changed territorial control concepts throughout the galaxy. Corrupted planets provided consortium forces with permanent income streams by reducing enemy effectiveness, creating strategic value in planets that other factions might ignore. Zan's Defiler hero unit spread corruption across enemy worlds, establishing criminal influence without requiring conventional conquest. Meanwhile, their unique unit roster included cloaking vengeance frigates that bypass shields entirely, and massive aggressor star destroyers stolen from Imperial shipyards, giving the consortium military options that felt distinctly criminal, powerful through theft and deception rather than legitimate production. StarCraft achieved something most developers consider impossible: 3 factions with completely different production systems, resource requirements, and tactical doctrines that remained perfectly balanced across 2 decades of competitive play. This is roughly equivalent to creating a sport where one team plays football, another plays basketball, and the third plays chess, and then somehow making all 3 equally viable at the professional level. Terran forces operated through familiar military-industrial complexes, producing versatile units from structures that could be relocated and repaired. Protoss civilization relied on expensive, technologically superior units powered by psionic energy and supported by shields that regenerated between engagements. The Zerg represented the most radical departure from traditional RTS conventions. Their organic units spawned from larvae rather than factories, with production speed determined by available hatcheries rather than build queues. Zerg structures required creep to function, creating territorial control mechanics that other factions lacked entirely. This biological approach to warfare meant Zerg players thought in terms of evolution and adaptation rather than conventional military logistics. Playing Zerg felt less like commanding an army and more like managing a particularly aggressive ant colony with delusions of galactic conquest. The resulting strategic depth emerged from interactions between three entirely different approaches to the same core objectives. Universe at War attempted to solve the asymmetric design problem through radical mechanical differentiation, which sounds like fancy academic language for what if we made everything completely insane. The Hierarchy faction abandoned traditional base building in favour of mobile megastructures that served as factories, research centres and weapons platforms simultaneously. These walking cities could be customised with different hardpoints and moved across battlefields as strategic situations demanded. Nova's forces operated through flow-based economics where resources travelled along visible networks between structures. Destroying key nodes could cripple entire production chains, while redundant pathways provided resilience against focused attacks. The Masari introduced light and dark modes that completely transformed unit capability and tactical options, effectively doubling their strategic complexity, because apparently having one completely different faction wasn't challenging enough for the development team. These factions required players to master entirely different concepts of resource management, territorial control, and unit production, creating learning curves that felt like switching between different games. The game's commitment to mechanical differentiation extended into combat systems that barely resembled each other. Hierarchy players managed massive, slow-moving fortresses that required careful positioning and long-term planning, while Nova's commanders optimized resource flows and network. Masari forces shifted between offensive and defensive modes based on tactical requirements, creating decision points that existed nowhere else in the game. Universe at War failed commercially, but its design experiments influenced asymmetric thinking throughout the strategy genre by proving that factions could share virtually nothing beyond basic objectives. Grey Goo achieved the most complete asymmetric design in RTS history by questioning every fundamental assumption about how strategy games functioned, then throwing most of those assumptions into the wood chipper. The human faction operated through conventional base building with factories, power plants and defensive structures. The beta faction used modular components that could combine into larger structures and relocate as battlefield conditions changed, creating dynamic bases that adapted to strategic requirements. The Goo faction eliminated buildings entirely. These nanomachine swarms spread across maps like living organisms, consuming resources directly and spawning units from any controlled territory. Goo players managed flowing organic systems where every decision affected the entire collective consciousness. Traditional concepts like base defense or production bottlenecks became meaningless when your entire faction existed as a distributed network of self-replicating machines that probably violated several laws of physics and definitely violated the Geneva Convention. This design forced players to develop completely different strategic mindsets depending on their chosen faction. Human players focused on defensive positioning and production efficiency. Beta players managed modular logistics and structural adaptation, while Goo players thought in terms of organic growth and territorial consumption. The game succeeded because each faction's strengths and weaknesses created natural counters that maintained competitive balance despite radically different play experiences. Watching high-level Grey Goo matches felt like observing three different species attempt to solve the same problem using completely incompatible evolutionary strategies. Grey Goo's asymmetry extended beyond mechanics into fundamental concepts of space and time within the game world. Human bases occupied fixed positions that could be defended or destroyed. Beta installations existed as temporary configurations that adapted to changing needs, while Goo presence represented territorial control rather than structural occupation. These differences created strategic interactions impossible in conventional RTS design, where attacks against different faction types required completely different approaches and counter-strategies. The game demonstrated that asymmetric design could push far beyond unit variety into reimagining how strategy games conceptualize conflict itself. Faction asymmetry has existed since the earliest strategy games. Chess gives white the first move advantage, creating different opening strategies for each side. This fundamental imbalance produces some of the most compelling strategic experiences in gaming. Games like Supreme Commander achieve competitive depth through factions that play similarly but with subtle variations, relying on player skill within shared systems. The true test of strategic thinking comes from mastering asymmetric factions that operate under completely different rules, where success requires understanding unique mechanics rather than applying universal strategies. These 5 games represent the peak of asymmetric design because they force players to think differently rather than simply execute familiar patterns with different units. Learning to maximize asymmetric faction effectiveness requires abandoning preconceptions about how strategy games could work and embracing entirely new approaches to familiar problems. In Friday's episode of the Critical Moves podcast, we'll talk about how modern real-time strategy has changed and what's to come in the future. It should be interesting, so give it a listen. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. Goodbye.